Bruce has joined us. You all will remember if you were at annual gathering last year. Bruce Epperly was our opening night preacher. Excellent job. Bruce and I have known each other 40 years, about having gone to
I fear it's more than that, Tony.
Together. It probably is, but I'll claim
when did you start seminary?
76.
Okay, it would have been 76
That's
then.
right. Yeah.
And trombones to go with it.
Yeah, back in the back before some of our colleagues were born, and anyway.
I was in junior high school then.
Oh, you're killing me! You're killing me.
Thanks for sharing, Laura.
But we're forever young.
That's right.
That's right.
I tell people I'm a certain age. I'm of a certain age. I refuse to be old.
That's right. Younger than the pyramids.
That's right. But Bruce has been doing some writing and speaking on faith in the time of pandemic. Your book came yesterday, so I didn't get a chance to read it, but I did get a chance to see the video that you sent us a link to, where you answer that question: is coronavirus God's judgment? Which is, I was glad you answered no to that question.
Yes, yes.
So if you just talk a little bit with us, and then if people have questions, we'll entertain those, if you don't mind.
Well, sure. It's a joy to be here, and it's a joy to see Mike Carlson, who I fear is as old as I am too. And so, again, that class, at least in my case, of 75 coming into Claremont Graduate School and Seminary, we still have a little life to us yet. It's good to see some faces that I remember just about a year ago. I believe I was at the General Assembly and enjoyed being with you over at Rainer Park Church. And I'm honored to have been invited back here to speak with you and talk a little bit about faith in a time of pandemic, and to tag on to a few of the comments I've already heard. You may hear some noise. Somebody's just decided to mow his lawn in the neighborhood, and being a true COVID person, we have had our two grandchildren, aged 9 and 7. They're in the living room next door to me almost every day for 7 hours a day, doing homeschooling,
Right.
the best we can do. And so they may come roaring in here. They've roared into virtually every lecture I've given online in the world over the past few months, and that's okay, because it makes it real. I want to just make a couple comments and then open it up to conversations, knowing that we're all trying to figure out what to do right now. Certainly, I want to start with the affirmation that everything the church does and everything ministers do should be guided by theology and spirituality and pastoral care and practical wisdom. I just got a memo. It's a wonderful memo from the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. I'm duly ordained, with all sorts of comments about how to phase back into church worship, how to phase back in. Though none of us in the United Church of Christ out here are in a big hurry.
Yeah, exactly.
But nevertheless, how to begin the process. And at first glance, between Zoom, between phasing in, it's hard to get the trees in the forest. It's hard not to get confused. It's hard not to put the practicalities ahead of the theology. Now, I want to make a few confessional things. And here's one of my grandchildren. He just came in to say hi to you guys. This is my grandchild, Jack Epperly.
Hi, Jack.
Hi, Jack. Who lives in the village next door to ours, Osterville on Cape Cod. But these have been 3 of the longest months of my life. Does that seem like it to you?
Yes.
Yeah, amen.
Do I have a witness out there?
Amen.
You got a witness. Amen.
Amen.
Time has stopped.
The only longer time in my life that I can remember was when our son was diagnosed with cancer and took about 3 months of treatments. And those are about the three longest times in our life because all of us had plans.
Yeah.
I had a plan for a speaking tour through the Southwest and to celebrate my wife's and mine 40th anniversary of ordination at Saguaro Christian Church down in Tucson.
Nice.
And we were going to do that. I was going to give some lectures in Colorado. All those went by the by. We were planning our Easter services, and certainly one of them that's a high point is the service on the beach. Our church is near the beach in Cape Cod. We were planning a big stewardship campaign and summer programs, and of course all of that right now is on hold. And like you, and I'm trying to think, maybe it was Lori who was speaking. Like you, our time has become programmed, hasn't it?
Yep.
Like you, we have become too busy at some level, more busy than we imagined, haven't we?
Yeah, amen.
Some of us are parenting, some of us are grandparenting. Over and beyond this, we have several hours of work a day with our congregations. And I don't know about you, but I haven't done 12-hour days, 5 days a week, if I include my grandchildren, for quite a little while. My day begins about, 4:30 in the morning when I start studying and reading and writing, and goes to about 6:30 at night. And I have to admit, this is nap time for me on Cape Cod. So I may depend on you, Tony or Mike, who have the relationship to do this, to wake me up.
Okie doke, I'll do it.
All right.
These times cry out for theological reflection. These times cry out for spiritual formation, both for lay people and for pastors. We're all under stress, whether or not we admit it. We're all grieving, whether or not we admit it. We're all uncertain about the future of our congregations, whether or not we admit it. Does that make sense to any of you?
It does.
Yeah, very much so.
We're all trying to figure out if the Zoom services, as good as they are, or the streaming that we may do on Amazon, how long a shelf life that has. Are people going to start to drift away after a while? Are their pledges going to start drifting away after a while?
Yeah, that's a concern.
Where will we stand 3 months from now if we happen to be in a place where the greatest wisdom we have says, don't worship publicly till the end of the summer?
Yeah.
Certainly, I think if you're in a church in LA County, that would seem to be what would be normative. Well, crises bring out the best and the worst of us. Certainly, many people think of this whole issue as God's judgment. And of course, most of us here don't. Yeah. But we need to ponder theological alternatives. Certainly today, I was looking on one of my news feeds, a study indicated that about 70% of Americans believe that the coronavirus is some sort of sign, some sort of wake-up call. It was uncertain exactly what that wake-up call is, but it's a wake-up call to us. They didn't unpack it to say whether or not God caused us to wake us up, but that leads to some interesting reflection in our congregations. Yep. Virtually everyone in our churches has become a bit of a theologian during this time. People who never thought they'd be doing theology are asking questions not unlike my 9-year-old grandson, who says, well, why can't God just stop this right now?
Yeah, there you go.
He doesn't have a placard like somebody in Michigan that says, I want a haircut. His placard would more say, I want to play soccer on my team. I want to play baseball. I want to be playing basketball with my buds. I want to have a sleepover. But why doesn't God stop this? Or even the question of opening or closing our church shouldn't be decided entirely pragmatically. It needs to be reflected theologically. As a theologian, I believe that you can have authentic church on Zoom just as much as you can have in your sanctuary. As a theologian, I believe that if God is omnipresent, if God is present everywhere, then there's no place that's absent from God's care, God's inspiration, God's love, God's transformation. And Zoom could very well be the place where Jacob wakes up after a dream and says, God was in this place and I did not know it. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, we decided we have two types of services our church has done during the pandemic. The associate pastor of our church does a pre-recorded Vespers on Sunday night and a meditation on Wednesday evening that comes out. And I lead the Sunday morning service, which is entirely live, very much like you. And certainly when we've tried to sing hymns together, it has ended up being an amazing disaster. But what happens in my service, I lead at 10 in the morning Eastern time, people log on at 9:30. And they're talking to each other for half an hour. I'll go over and get a cup of coffee and a bagel, and they'll be talking with one another, because at least our congregation, in spite of the fact they have a pretty fair theologian as their pastor, is a community primarily.
Right.
They come to church to be with one another. And I weighed the balance of having a really streamlined, high-tech service that was unidirectional, or one that was a little messy. Yeah. And that was live. And the messy service has really been a place of inspiration. People bring their hopes, their fears, their dreams. We always have a prayer time like many of your churches. Sometimes it goes on for 15 minutes because people need to pray. People need to touch one another, at least spiritually, even if they aren't physically distant. So I believe, first off, that having those services online are places of revelation, that you can be as inspired there as you can in the sanctuary. That's what we've been saying all along, isn't it? I know at our church, one of the mantras is the church is not the church building. Right. Even though we have a beautiful 225-year-old building that's a beautiful New England structure, but our church is outside. Our church is outside. I believe as a theologian, we can have to believe that God is working for good in every situation. That God is working even through this situation, a situation that I don't believe God caused, to bring forth beauty and goodness and love. That God didn't cause the virus, but is working for healing within the virus. That God's revelation, one of the things we can do that's really important in our churches is to say, and maybe even preach about this next week, God's revelation is global. One of our marquee signs, we have a church sign, out in front of the church like many of you do. And one side says, our worship may be shuttered this week, but God's heart is always open. And we have our rainbow bar right under that. The other sign on the other side says, God is revealed in faith and science. Because I think one of the things we as Christians need to be doing as pastors in the Christian church, disciples of Christ, is to say that science matters.
Absolutely.
To say that science matters, that it's a source of revelation just as much as the sermon I might be preaching this afternoon. That God is working as much in the lives of the environmentalists, the people working on vaccines, the honest researchers, the epidemiologists, as God is in any sanctuary. Yeah. Because that makes a witness right now, especially since maybe 30% of Christendom right now is at war with science. Jesus is my Savior, but as Steve Kimball told me recently, and Steve and I do a weekly podcast, Faith on the Edge, some church has a sign that says, Jesus is my vaccine. Now, I think they were arguing that if you believe in Jesus, nothing's going to happen to you.
Right.
And you don't have to pay attention to science. And you don't have to look for the revelation of God elsewhere in the wider world. That God wants us to be faithful and also responsible.
Yeah.
I initially wrote this little book, Faith in a Time of Pandemic, and it's the first of I've just finished a book now, short book, about 60 pages. This is 40 pages. I wrote it over a weekend. I was walking on the beach one morning and I heard a whisper in my ear. I actually believe that God speaks to us and says, you need to write this book. And as some of you who know me, I probably write everything I think and then some. Things I don't even think I write sometimes. Yes, Walter, what do I want to be inoculated against? Sometimes bad religion. But I had this and I prayed about it as I was walking down the beach. And by the time I got to my car, I had the outline of the book in my head. And so I sat down for a few days and wrote it. And I felt it was inspired. The next one, and you can invite me back later, Tony, is called Hope Beyond Pandemic. I'm starting to think about life beyond pandemic and how the church and how our country needs to change. It's much more of a political book than this one. We need consolation now, but we'll need plenty of challenge later, because I think the pandemic has revealed the inherent injustices in our country.
Absolutely.
And the inherent inequalities, racism, sexism, isms of all manners in our country. And I think the Christian exceptionalism and the American exceptionalism have been revealed as morally bankrupt and spiritually so. So theology is important, and I think it's an opportunity for you as pastors to really become the theologians of your congregations, to take seriously theological reflection, because people are interested and hungry to make some sense of this, not superficial sense, not instant answers, but somebody who's wrestling with the issue.
Yeah.
I want to take a moment just to talk about how to stay healthy in a time of pandemic. And I was appreciative of Tammy's comment, and I hope you're still with us, even though I just see a big T there. Many of us who are pastors are feeling somewhat stressed. Is that fair to say?
That is fair.
Many of us are having to learn new tricks. I must make confession. I'm an old hand. I've been around ministry and teaching for 40 years. I can show up and preach a sermon on the drop of a hat almost anywhere, or give a lecture on one. They may have to carry me out, but I can do that. I have to admit, I feel more weary after that Zoom service than I ever do after any service of public worship. It's 11 o'clock. It's the people have gotten out in 45 minutes off Zoom. I'm ready to take to my bed.
Amen.
I get on that and I wonder, is it going to crash on me?
Right.
Yeah, that's the issue. We have to learn the two. On top of everything else, we're learning new technology, and we're not sure of it a lot of the times.
And then I feel guilty if somebody can't get on. Sometimes in the middle of the service, and you see they're kind of getting on and getting off and getting on and getting off. And at least among my pastor friends, many of us are more weary than we were before. And I think you really made a leading comment, Tammy, that these are times where we might succumb to what Luther called works righteousness. That since we are not visible, since it looks like we're only working 1 hour a week, remember that old minister's joke? Since we're at home and we might be taking care of our children, or in my case, grandchildren, we want to be a good value to our congregations, right?
Yeah, amen.
My colleague, the associate pastor of our church, wanted to take a couple weeks off in June, and I said to her, don't bother to call it vacation, just get out of here, and don't think about church for 2 weeks. And the comment that was made, I'd feel guilty if I did that. And I said, you're doing enough already, aren't you? You don't need to feel guilty for not showing up for something. Many of us have foregone vacations, haven't we?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to be gone for about 5 or 6 weeks, but during this time, I don't feel like, as the ship captain, I should leave the ship.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, Bruce, is I know a couple people who have had to postpone long planned and well-deserved sabbaticals.
Yeah, the second half of mine is one of these.
Mhm.
And you know, I know the feeling about that personally. I had other plans, but you know, we've postponed sabbaticals, holidays. We've postponed doing funerals.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most difficult pastoral situations that I've ever had was telling somebody I couldn't do their funeral. Not their funeral, but their relative's funeral.
Mhm.
That I just couldn't do that, you know, that it was not appropriate for me to do it at this point in time. And, you know, luckily it was a memorial service, so they'll wait on me. They'll wait on me. Thank God for memorial services.
Yeah.
But I think that we have to remember that as pastors, we're under stress. We're anxious about many things. We're grieving. We may have more responsibilities in our family life than we did 3 months ago. Again, I see my grandchildren on an average 3 or 4 afternoons prior to the pandemic. They come rolling into the house at 9:20 right after we finish morning prayer here at church on Zoom, and they're there till 4:30, 5:30, 6:30, with the exception of one day a week when they get off at noon. Ah. And they're 9 and 7, so they're good boys who are ready to tear the house up at any moment. Many of us are feeling a little bit depressed, and it's normal depression. It's not clinical depression. It's the depression of we feel when we're disconnected from things that, as Tony said early on, give us life. If we get life out of stopping in and visiting at the hospital to people who are sick and can't do it anymore, at least you can't in Massachusetts. If we get life out of sitting with our congregants and being with them in a classroom or in a pastoral counseling or spiritual formation center session, if we get life out of public worship, a little depression is likely for us. But even us in our situation as leaders need to remember that God is with us. I wrote a book a few years ago, and I might as well flog another book, called A Center in the Cyclone, A Center in the Cyclone. It's clergy self-care in the 21st century, a center in a cyclone. And to me, this feels like a cyclone. And how we as pastors can remain centered in this time. And again, as one of you said, to discern which simple spiritual practices work for you at this time of your life to restore your spirits. Finally, I'll just say a few more words, and then probably something more interesting will come up once I've quit talking. The first is that opening the church needs to be grounded in God's global revelation in science and spirituality. How we open the church needs to be theologically grounded as well as pragmatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I see oftentimes is we're just simply going to open it and go through the practices of opening a church pragmatically. We need to have a theological foundation for the time we decide to reopen the church. And it is a matter of listening to the experts. It's a matter of recognizing, as I said earlier, that God's truth is revealed in science as well as Scripture. It's a matter of realizing that God is present whether or not we're in a sanctuary.
Yeah, exactly.
That God is present not only in our building, but definitely beyond our building. One of the things that I remember from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, and I've done a little bit of work in process theology over the years, is that the higher organisms, and I'm making a real leap to assume I'm one of them, but the higher organisms initiate novelty to match the novelty of the environment. Higher organisms initiate novelty to match the novelty of the environment, in contrast to being overwhelmed by the environment or denying the environment. We can deny the pandemic and go about his business as usual, and some people are trying to do that, right?
Yeah.
We can be overwhelmed by it and think that it's the only reality with which we deal.
Right.
Or we can say, where is, in this event that God did not choose, did not cause, is unrelated to any sort of judgment, where can we initiate something new and creative to respond for the days and years ahead?
Makes some sense.
Well, I'm open to thoughts or questions, or maybe playing basketball or cornhole with my grandchildren, whatever happens.
Do y'all have any questions, comments for Bruce in these next few minutes?
Yeah, I do. Hillary Marks. I'm from Geisville, California. And I was reading NPR this morning, and the CDC, they gave a synopsis of the CDC guideline for opening. And it specifically said that it avoids talking about faith communities, but it talked about schools. And I made a correlation there that for a school to open, it's going to need to have adequate testing and the ability to make everything sanitary in place. And I took that as my revelation for how a church should open. And I think if we can't get adequate testing for our people, and we can't make sure that everything's sanitized, and I mean, if a school can do that, a church should be able to.
Okay, that's a practical question, and I have a resource that I don't know if you've seen. Our Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ just set out something called Phasing In. That's a pretty significant document. I'll send it to you, Tony. Your disciples are probably doing similar things, I suspect.
We are, but we're collecting everything. So please send it to me.
It's a really quite a good document, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the practical, because I'm no better at it than anybody else. But I've just begun as a pastor of a congregation to prepare the congregation's leaders and the trustees and the board that that's going to take a few weeks of hard work to prepare the building.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a few weeks, and it's going to take people working before and after the service to prepare the building. And it's going to take, we have to make serious decisions, because we have about half a dozen groups that meet in our church. How we're going to bring them back in, how we can clean and disinfect after each meeting. And these are all 12-step groups, so they're basically groups that give us a pittance, so we really almost can't afford to do the cleanup afterwards in terms of our sexton. Whether we need to double our sexton's hours, he's half-time now during that time. And of course, like many of our churches, our receipts have been lower recently than they were before. I don't know if any other churches have had a smaller income during this time. But, you know, it is an issue for people to seriously think about, I think, to be prepared to do it right. And that's a theological issue, because I've often told our trustees that brick and mortar are also spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sophia.
So I'm listening to you, and I'm scribbling notes furiously. And you said reopening the church needs to be theologically grounded, which
Yes.
I totally agree. So my first question is, may I cite you the next time I have to preach?
You can cite me anytime you want. I've been cited many. And of course, I will put a plug on something. I won't make any money off this, but I do a weekly lectionary commentary. I don't know if you know this, on Patheos, called Living the Holy Adventure, the Adventurous Lectionary.
No,
It's,
but I'd love to be able to get connected to that.
Yeah,
That
so
would be
look
great.
up Patheos, or just go online and see my name and the Adventurous Lectionary. It's a purely progressive, I don't try to do exegesis in it. I just kind of run with what I think are big ideas, or ideas that I don't sometimes even dare preach. But you know, but yeah. So I think theologically grounded, Sophia, is absolutely essential.
Right.
Because,
So I wrote also, our call is to be transformative, because you said something about being novel. So
Yes.
I wrote, our call is to be transformative and not novel. And then, so the question then becomes, how then will reopening the church bring about transformation? How is getting back in the sanctuary, this rush to get back into worshiping in the building, going to bring about the transformation that we are supposed to actively be engaged in facilitating?
And I think that's really the great question, is it, Sophia? Because again, there is a heavy pressure to move back to the normal. We want to get back to the way things were 3 months ago. We want to get back to those. But I think we know that the things we were, and I realize churches have, I've been in the church business like Tony I'm much older than Tony, but for almost 40 years. And I realize how much investment we have in not changing, how much investment we have in staying the way things are, but in truth matter, we can't. We have to discern what it is that new thing. And one interesting thing that our church did, and I'll commend them, and these ideas came from the congregation, not from me. Instead of Easter lilies, they said, because we weren't going to be open on Easter, we're going to give the money to the food bank.
Yeah.
We are have a capital campaign, and we were already going to contribute 10% of that to things other than the building. So the remainder of our benevolence from the capital campaign went for the vulnerable in our town. We decided to give $100 grocery cards to every family that was in need in the local school. And this is a church that runs at a deficit every year. We have a decent enough endowment. We can afford it for the time being.
Yeah.
But, they chose, and I'm holding them to it. They chose at a time where they could draw the wagons, get nervous. We are nervous. That's good. Let's not assume we aren't, but they could close the doors in terms of their hearts. They could, we're in a very upscale community, Centerville on Cape Cod, but a mile away in Hyannis, there's 50% of the kids are on child support for lunch. Mm-hmm. And there's a fairly large homeless community. We've started a homeless service out there over the past year as well under my colleague in ministry. Churches need to see, I think, that our future is not in the sanctuary. And that's one of the novelties, Sophia. Our future is beyond the sanctuary, even though we're going to be in the sanctuary. I think that I've discovered that looking ahead, the next, and I'm thinking of Daniel up there in the green theology, it is clear to me that the next big pandemic that we are absolutely unprepared about is climate change. Mm-hmm. And there's absolutely no vaccine for that other than our decisions. And knowing how our churches are, how do we position ourselves to think of what are the things we need to be about to be faithful beyond this time? We've got a lot to do. So those are some thoughts off my head, knowing that probably my first responsibility will be just as a pastor will be just to make them feel good about being in the building and being what they used to describe in systems theory as a non-anxious presence, so that they'll feel confident enough to go do what they need to do. And I want to comment again to Tammy's comment earlier on, and I'm glad I was there when you made it. Looking beyond, and I was just hatched an idea as I was walking this morning. That's where I get all my writing ideas, walking on the beach. I write occasionally for the Alvin Institute's newsletter. And one of the things that said, Bruce, you ought to write something about pastoral self-care after people return to their churches, because I think ministers are going to want to try to make up for lost time. I think we're going to try to prove that we were really working all that time. I think we're going to try to prove that, I mean, you were right on target, Tammy. I mean, you were speaking to my choir, at least, as everyone else is, as Sophia is speaking to my choir, is that we're going to try works righteousness like hell once we get back. You know, we want to show them we earned our salary. You know, we want to show them we're worth something, and we're tempted probably to do more than we ought to. And probably every minister has several vocations besides being the pastor of their church. There may be have a significant relationship. Maybe they're a parent or a grandparent. Maybe they're involved in the politics of the community. All those are vocational too. And of course, the primary tool of ministry is the minister themselves. And if the primary tool is you, you better take care of it. You better take care of yourself. So because we're in a marathon, it's going to be a marathon after this. Anyone in their right mind knows that the effects of the pandemic will go on for a handful of years. And things will never return. Just think of small restaurants. Things will never return the way they used to. And just think of the way people are now trying to think about seating in restaurants. I was pondering with, you know, the people at my congregation probably get tired of me thinking out loud sometimes. I was pondering, how are we going to seat people in church?
That's right.
Are we going to, we can seat about 40, I guess, in about a 250 seat building, sanctuary, but will we seat couples together? That sounds a little unjust. You know what I'm saying? You know, are we going to single out single people? I mean, obviously parents and children have to sit together, I think. But then we ponder, well, how do we do church school the way we used to do it?
That's right. Yeah.
We won't be in those classrooms, even though they're really nice classrooms.
Right.
So again, we have a lot of thinking to do, and we need to take care of ourselves so that we have creative thoughts. If we're tired, we aren't going to be creative. If we're tired, our emotional lives are going to shut down. And we need to take care of ourselves. And you know, what does Song of Songs say? I've taken care of everybody else's vineyard and I've forgotten my own. So take care of your vineyard. Have a good glass of wine if it's appropriate. Enjoy life. When you're doing that communion at the disciple church, if you want to slip a little wine into the chalice, they won't know it.
Nobody will know. That's right.
I didn't have any grape juice, so I had a big glass of wine, and that certainly did inspire me to take a nap after worship. It was only 11 o'clock when I was done, but you know, you think about how are you going to take care of yourself for the long haul, for your family, for your friends, for your church, so that this is all going to be joy.
Hey, Bruce, this is Clarence Johnson. I appreciate your sharing so richly with us today. And I want to confess that I'm in the grieving group. I want to admit that I'm grieving. And part of why I'm grieving is because of what I've seen as sort of an assault on the sanctity of human life.
Well, yes.
When there are more than 86,000 people who've lost their lives to this virus, and at least from my perspective, it didn't have to be this way.
No.
I'm thinking, what is it we can do as people of faith? And I shared this with the Golden Gate to Pebble Beach group yesterday, looking at Leviticus 25, verses 17. Could we not, as disciples, come up with a Jubilee fund? There are more than 36 million people who've lost their jobs. As you pointed out, there are people going to food banks who 3 months ago never thought they would ever do this. Can we create a Jubilee fund to help people for the next year at least, you know, with their finances? I received one of those stimulus checks, $1,200. It was good. I didn't actually need it. But for those who have to pay rent, you know, for the next number of months, those who have to pay mortgages, they're going to need a little bit more than $1,200. That goes pretty quickly. Can we do something in terms of a Jubilee fund to help people who have lost their jobs, individuals, families, small businesses, to make sure they have the financial wherewithal they need to survive and thrive over these next 12 months.
And this is especially something to think about in churches where there are more privileged members of the community, where there really is, and this isn't true for every church, obviously, but a lot of churches have far more than the widow's mite in their family accounts and the accounts of the people who are members. And how do we continue to invite people to have generosity, not generosity of us versus them, we have, you don't, but generosity that's built into the human condition? I think, Clarence, that's a wonderful idea. The United Church of Christ has been raising money to defray people's medical costs.
Yes, right.
And our regional bridge ministers, the South New England Conference is an amalgamation now of 3 conferences: Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And they were having people bid on the conference ministers wearing which one had the best pajamas. Now, I wouldn't want to see any of them in pajamas, but having said that, you're right on target. You're right on target. The other thing that I think you said really important, Clarence, and I'm a big fan of Abraham Joshua Heschel's books on the prophets. I just think it's probably it and Walter Brueggemann's are the 2 best interpretations of the prophets, and there wouldn't be a Brueggemann without a Heschel. The job of a prophet is sometimes to lament.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because there's a lot of lamentation in our church about exactly what you're saying, and people are afraid to say it. They're worried that if they start crying, they won't be able to stop crying. It's virtually no day goes by that something doesn't cause me to weep.
Yeah.
Virtually, and I do a daily. I've started doing a daily devotion, and I'm not very for the church, and it's probably my way of trying to prove that I'm doing something. But I'm trying to do a daily devotion. Every so often I say, you know, I'm really grieving over this, and once in a while somebody will say, yeah, I'm glad you shared that because I'm really troubled by this too. And I think the cost of humankind, the cost in terms of the sort of the death of the American illusion, I think most of us are grieving if we think about it, regardless of our feelings about our nation's justice system and our injustice over the years. We still probably, some of us buried some illusion that we could solve problems.
Yeah. That
we were somehow better positioned to do what needed to be done in other countries, and this has certainly proven us wrong. Some of it is leadership, in my opinion, but we have been shown to be, Belshazzar, who is a good name for the president, I think, but Belshazzar has been shown that the writing is on the wall, and we came up short.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Clarence, I think you're right on target, and I think those who can be invited to be generous. The ones who have the privilege, all truth be told, though, some who don't may give much more than their more wealthy partners.
This is Laura. One of the things that I actually have a question for you much more seasoned ministers. So
that means I'm older. I'm very well seasoned, Laura. I'm very well seasoned. I just had some chili, so.
But doing being able to do communion every Sunday. I talked about that in my introduction and what we're doing. But one thing I was wondering about is the other sacrament of baptism. How is anybody have had to address that during this?
I have not, and I feel blessed, I suppose. Can you do a virtual baptism is an interesting question, isn't it? We certainly do intercessory prayer, don't we? and certainly we pray and assume that the prayer doesn't end at our nose. Yeah. I have some interest in some energy work. I'm a master teacher in the field of Reiki. if you're familiar with that. I'm a master teacher. And so you can give energy work at a distance. Can you baptize at a distance? It certainly would be novel, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
You certainly can lead somebody to Jesus at a distance, can't you?
Yeah.
There you go.
Franklin Graham is trying to do it on cable news. I see him with the come to Jesus and the implicit threat that you're going to hell if you don't. Yeah, but I think we have to sort of say, maybe again, I'm not I don't have a in quotes magical view of the sacraments, but I think that you could say to somebody, could you, in the meantime, just put some water on yourself while I'm praying for you?
Well, because we believe in submersion.
Yeah.
Does that change how, I don't know. I just, my thought was to wait till after it's over, but then again, I don't want to wait. What does somebody want?
Well, yeah, and perhaps you could, perhaps you could pray with somebody and ask that God be present in that moment to transform their life in a healing way. And let it be so. Let it be so.
Yeah. I think that, Laura, that's a great question. I'm working with somebody whose ordination had to be postponed.
Yes.
To work on how we do that. I think part of what's happening is that we're at our hour. And so, Bruce, it's clear this conversation is not over.
Well, invite me back sometime in the future. I grew up around here. I grew up in San Jose and in King City, so this is my home area. I was expecting to be back here in August or September for my high school reunion number 50. But it's been canceled.
Oh my goodness. So we will have you back.
I'd love to come back. I love being with folks like you. God bless you all.
Thank you. And let me
and
say
Walter, God bless you.
Well done.
Let me say to our Disciples colleagues, I've scheduled another meeting like this for June 19th with Rosario Ibarra from Disciples Church Extension Fund to talk with us about both stewardship and then maybe even how we re-enter our buildings. So be on the lookout for that. But we will, of course, have Bruce back to continue this conversation as well.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back outside. It's a sunny day at the beach.
Okay, terrific.
Bye.
This has been good. Thank you.
Okay, you all take care. God bless you all.